The gym doors opened at 5 a.m. sharp, but Frank Thompson was always there by 4:30. Every morning, 7 days a week, his old Ford pickup truck would pull into the empty parking lot of Murphy's Fitness Center, its engine making that familiar rattling sound that spoke of years on the road and thousands of miles behind it. Frank never hurried. He moved with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned long ago that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes led to consequences he didn't want to think about. His keys jingled softly as he unlocked the back entrance, the sound echoing in the pre-dawn silence of the small town of Millfield, Pennsylvania. At 68, Frank looked older than his years. His hair had gone completely gray, and deep lines marked his weathered face like a roadmap of experiences he never talked about. He wore the same thing every day: worn blue jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and work boots that had seen better decades. His hands were calloused and strong, the hands of a man who had worked with them his entire life. The gym was Frank's domain in the early morning hours. He knew every corner, every piece of equipment, every stain on the rubber mats that needed extra attention. He moved through his routine with mechanical precision, checking the locks, turning on the lights section by section, starting the ventilation system, and setting the temperature controls. Murphy's Fitness wasn't fancy. It was a no-frills place that attracted serious athletes, weekend warriors, and people who just wanted to work out without pretense. The walls were lined with free weights that had been dropped thousands of times. The boxing ring in the corner showed its age with patched canvas and tape-wrapped ropes. Motivational posters from the 1990s hung crooked on the walls, their edges curled and colors faded. Frank began each day the same way, sweeping the main floor, wiping down the equipment, checking that everything was in its proper place. He worked in silence, the only sounds being the whisper of his broom across the floor and the distant hum of traffic beginning to build on Main Street. By 4:45, the first athletes would start arriving. Usually, it was the serious ones, the fighters training for upcoming matches, the powerlifters preparing for competitions, the runners who needed the treadmills before the heat of the day set in. They would nod to Frank if they noticed him at all, most barely registering his presence as they focused on their own goals and routines. Frank didn't mind being invisible. In fact, he preferred it. He had spent most of his adult life trying to blend into the background, to be useful without being noticed, to do his job and go home without drawing attention to himself. It was a skill he had learned in another life, in another time, when being seen could mean the difference between coming home and not coming home at all. The gym's owner, Mike Murphy, was a good man who treated Frank fairly. Mike had inherited the business from his father 10 years ago and had kept Frank on without question. The older man was reliable, honest, and asked for nothing more than his modest salary and the freedom to do his work without interference. Mike suspected there was more to Frank's story than met the eye, but he had learned not to ask questions. Some men carried their past quietly, and Frank Thompson was clearly one of them. As the morning progressed and more people filled the gym, Frank would retreat to the background. He restocked the towel dispensers, cleaned the mirrors, emptied the trash bins, and made sure the water fountains were working properly. He listened to the conversations around him, young men bragging about their latest achievements, women discussing their fitness goals, trainers encouraging their clients to push harder. Frank remembered being young once, remembered the confidence and certainty that came with strong muscles and quick reflexes. But that was long ago, in a place far from this small Pennsylvania town, under circumstances he tried not to remember during his waking hours. The dreams, however, were a different matter. Jake Martinez was 23 years old and believed he was going to change the world, one boxing match at a time. He had joined Murphy's Fitness 6 months ago after moving to Millfield to train with Tommy Kowalski, a former professional fighter who now coached promising amateurs out of the gym's boxing ring. Jake was everything Frank was not: loud, confident, always ready with a story or a joke. He wore expensive workout clothes and the latest athletic shoes. His social media accounts were filled with videos of his training sessions and photos of his meals, carefully curated to build his brand as an up-and-coming fighter. But Jake was also dedicated. He arrived every morning at 5:15, 15 minutes after the gym opened, ready to work. He trained hard, pushed himself to his limits, and showed respect for the sport and his coach. These qualities, Frank noted silently as he cleaned around the boxing area, were becoming increasingly rare in young people. For months, Jake had barely noticed the quiet janitor who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Frank was just part of the scenery, like the old fight posters on the walls or the worn punching bags hanging from the ceiling. But one morning in late September, something caught Jake's attention. Frank was cleaning the area around the heavy bags when one of them began to swing loose from its mounting. The chain had worked itself partially free, and the 150-pound bag was hanging at a dangerous angle. Without thinking, Jake called out a warning. "Hey, watch out! That bag's coming down!" What happened next made Jake stop his own workout and stare. Frank didn't panic or jump away. Instead, he stepped forward, caught the falling bag with both arms, and held it steady while using one hand to examine the loose chain. With movements that seemed impossibly smooth for a man his age, Frank lifted the heavy bag back into position and secured the chain with a technique that Jake, despite years of training in gyms, had never seen before. The entire incident lasted maybe 30 seconds. Frank tested the bag's stability, nodded to himself in satisfaction, and went back to his cleaning as if nothing had happened. But Jake stood frozen, his jump rope dangling from his hands, trying to process what he had just witnessed. Most men would have struggled to catch a bag that heavy. Some would have been knocked over by the momentum. Frank had handled it like it weighed nothing, with a calm competence that spoke of experience dealing with much more dangerous situations than a loose punching bag. "Nice catch," Jake said, approaching the older man. Frank looked up from his mop bucket, his gray eyes meeting Jake's for just a moment. "Chain was old," he said simply. "Should be replaced soon." "How did you know to do that thing with your hands?" "That stabilizing move?" Frank's expression didn't change. "You learn things," he said, then returned to his cleaning. Jake wanted to ask more questions, but something in Frank's manner suggested the conversation was over. Still, the young boxer found himself watching the janitor more carefully in the days that followed. He began to notice things he had missed before. Frank moved differently than other men his age. His posture was perfect, his balance always centered. When he walked, his eyes constantly scanned his surroundings, not with paranoia, but with an awareness that seemed automatic. When he lifted heavy equipment or moved obstacles, he did so with an efficiency that suggested years of physical training. Most telling of all were Frank's hands. They were scarred in ways that didn't come from janitorial work. Small, precise marks that looked like they might have come from rope burns, knife cuts, or worse. And when Frank gripped his mop handle or carried equipment, Jake noticed that his stance was always balanced, always ready, as if he expected trouble even in the safety of a small-town gym. Tommy Kowalski, Jake's trainer, had been around gyms for 40 years. He had trained fighters who went on to professional careers, and he had worked with tough men from all walks of life. One day, after Jake mentioned his observations about Frank, Tommy shared his own thoughts. "I've been wondering about him too," Tommy admitted as they wrapped Jake's hands for a sparring session. "Guy's been here longer than I have, but I don't know much about him. Mike Murphy trusts him completely, says he's never missed a day of work in 10 years. There's something about the way he moves," Jake said, "like he's ready for something to happen." Tommy nodded. "I've seen it in other guys. Usually means they've seen some action somewhere along the way. Military, maybe police work. But Frank doesn't talk about it, and around here, we respect that. Jake understood. Small towns had their unwritten rules, and one of them was that a man's past was his own business unless he chose to share it. But his curiosity about Frank only grew stronger. 3 weeks later, Jake's curiosity was rewarded with another glimpse into Frank's hidden depths. It was a busy Saturday morning, and the gym was crowded with weekend warriors trying to work off the excesses of their week. The boxing area was particularly busy, with several people using the heavy bags and speed bags simultaneously. Jake was working on his footwork in the ring when he heard raised voices near the weight section. 2 men were arguing over a piece of equipment, and their disagreement was escalating quickly. One was a regular at the gym, a construction worker named Bill, who was known for his short temper. The other was a newcomer, a younger man who had been making comments about other people's workouts all morning. "I was using that bench," Bill said, his voice carrying across the gym. "You walked away," the younger man replied. "You snooze, you lose." "I was getting water. My towel was right there." "I don't see your name on it." Jake could see the situation was heading toward trouble. Bill's face was red, and he was clenching his fists. The younger man was sneering, clearly enjoying the confrontation. Other gym members were starting to watch, and the atmosphere was becoming tense. That's when Frank appeared. Jake hadn't seen him approach. One moment the janitor was across the room, the next he was standing between the 2 men. He didn't say anything at first, just positioned himself casually so that he was within arm's reach of both potential combatants. "Gentlemen," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying just enough authority to make both men look at him. "Gym's got 3 bench press stations. 2 of them are open right now." The younger man looked annoyed at the interruption. "This is none of your business, old man." Frank's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Jake noticed it from his position in the ring. Frank's weight had shifted to the balls of his feet, his hands had moved into positions that looked casual but weren't, and his eyes had become more focused. "You're right," Frank said calmly. "It's not my business, but this is my gym to clean, and I'd rather not mop up blood today." There was something in the way he said it that made both men pause. Not a threat exactly, but a statement of fact delivered with absolute certainty. Bill, who knew Frank by sight, if not by name, nodded toward one of the open benches. "I'll use that one," he said, his anger deflating. The younger man looked like he wanted to continue the confrontation, but something in Frank's steady gaze made him reconsider. "Whatever," he muttered, and stalked away toward the cardio equipment. Frank waited until both men had moved away, then returned to his cleaning routine as if nothing had happened. But Jake had seen something in those few moments that confirmed his growing suspicions about the quiet janitor. Frank hadn't just diffused the situation, he had controlled it. His positioning, his body language, his timing had all been perfect. Most importantly, he had been ready for violence while hoping to avoid it, the mark of someone who had dealt with dangerous situations before. After his workout, Jake approached Tommy again. "Did you see what happened with Bill and that new guy?" Tommy nodded. Frank handled it well, kept it from getting ugly. "How did he know exactly what to do?" "Experience," Tommy said simply, "the kind you don't get from reading books." That afternoon, Jake decided to do some research. He knew Frank's full name from hearing Mike Murphy use it occasionally. Frank Thompson. It was a common enough name, but Jake hoped he might find something in online searches. Most of his searches turned up nothing useful. Too many Frank Thompsons in the world, and without more specific information, it was impossible to narrow down which one worked as a janitor in Millfield, Pennsylvania. But then, Jake remembered something. One morning, he had seen Frank reading a newspaper in the break room, and there had been a coffee mug on the table beside him. The mug had some kind of military insignia on it. Jake hadn't paid much attention at the time, but now he tried to remember details. It had been green, he thought, with gold lettering. Some kind of unit patch or emblem that he didn't recognize but that looked official and military. Jake's father had served in the Navy, and growing up, Jake had learned to recognize some military symbols and terminology. He spent an hour online looking at different unit patches and insignias, trying to find something that matched his memory of Frank's coffee mug. He didn't find an exact match, but he did learn enough to confirm his suspicions. The style and design of the patch he remembered were consistent with special operations units, the kind of elite military groups that didn't advertise their existence or activities. Jake realized he was probably never going to find Frank's story through internet searches. Men who served in special operations often had records that were classified or deliberately obscured. If Frank Thompson had been part of something sensitive during his military service, there might not be any public record of it at all. But Jake's curiosity was stronger than ever. He began paying even closer attention to Frank's behavior, looking for more clues about the man's mysterious past. October brought an early cold snap to Millfield, and with it came Jake's first real glimpse into who Frank Thompson really was. It happened on a Tuesday morning when the gym was nearly empty due to a severe thunderstorm that had been battering the area since midnight. Jake had almost skipped his workout that morning. The rain was coming down in sheets, the wind was howling, and the power had flickered several times at his apartment. But his fight was only 6 weeks away, and he couldn't afford to miss training sessions. He arrived at the gym soaked despite his sprint from the parking lot to the entrance. Frank was there, as always, but he seemed more alert than usual. Instead of his normal routine of quiet cleaning, he was checking windows, testing emergency lighting, and moving equipment away from areas where the roof might leak. "Bad storm," Jake commented as he dried off with a towel. Frank nodded, glancing toward the windows where lightning flickered almost continuously. Radio said tornado watch until noon. Jake had lived in Pennsylvania his entire life and had experienced severe weather before. But there was something about this storm that felt different. The wind seemed stronger, more persistent, and the lightning was almost constant. Only 3 other people had braved the weather to come to the gym that morning. An older woman who used the treadmills religiously, a powerlifter who was preparing for a competition, and a teenager whose mother dropped him off for a training session with one of the part-time trainers. Jake had been working out for about 30 minutes when the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in immediately, casting eerie shadows throughout the gym. Outside, the storm seemed to intensify, with wind that sounded like a freight train and rain that hammered against the windows with increasing force. "Everyone stay calm," Frank's voice carried clearly through the darkened gym. "Emergency lights will last about 2 hours. If the power doesn't come back, we'll need to evacuate." Jake noticed that Frank had appeared from somewhere in the back of the building carrying a heavy-duty flashlight and what looked like a 2-way radio. He was moving with purpose, checking on each person in the gym, making sure everyone was accounted for and safe. That's when they heard it. A sound like a locomotive bearing down on them, growing louder by the second. "Tornado!" Frank shouted. "Everyone to the back room now!" The back room Frank was referring to was a small storage area behind the main gym floor. It had no windows and was surrounded by concrete block walls, the safest place in the building during severe weather. Jake expected panic, confusion, people running in different directions. Instead, what he saw was Frank Thompson taking complete control of the situation with the calm authority of someone who had managed emergencies before. "Mrs. Patterson, take the boy and get to the back room," Frank directed the older woman and the teenager. "Steve, help me move this equipment rack in front of the door." The powerlifter, Steve, immediately responded to Frank's instructions. Together, they moved a heavy equipment rack to barricade the main entrance, preventing the door from being blown open by the wind. "Jake, grab those first aid kits from the wall and bring them with us," Frank ordered. Jake found himself following Frank's commands without question. There was something about the older man's demeanor that inspired instant confidence. He wasn't panicking, wasn't shouting, just efficiently organizing their response to the emergency. They all crowded into the storage room just as the tornado passed directly over the building. The sound was deafening, like standing inside a drum while someone beat it with hammers. The walls shook, dust fell from the ceiling, and they could hear debris hitting the roof above them. Frank positioned himself near the door, the radio in his hand crackling with emergency communications. Jake realized that the janitor was monitoring emergency frequencies, staying in contact with first responders and weather services. "How long until it passes?" the teenager asked, his voice shaky with fear. "Tornadoes move fast," Frank replied calmly. "Couple more minutes, and we should be clear." He was right. The terrible sound began to fade, and the building stopped shaking. Frank waited another 5 minutes, listening to the radio traffic, before he declared it safe to leave the storage room. When they emerged, they found that the main gym had suffered some damage. Several windows were broken, water was pooling on the floor, and some equipment had been moved around by the force of the wind. But the building was structurally sound, and everyone was unharmed. "Everyone okay?" Frank asked, doing a quick visual check of each person. They were all fine, just shaken by the experience. The teenager's mother arrived within 15 minutes, crying with relief when she saw her son was safe. Mrs. Patterson called her husband to pick her up. Steve helped Frank begin the cleanup process. Jake lingered, helping to move equipment and sweep up broken glass. As they worked, he found himself studying Frank with new eyes. The older man had handled the emergency with the competence of someone who had been trained for crisis situations. "You've done this before," Jake said, as they righted an overturned weight bench. Frank paused in his work, looking at Jake with an expression that was hard to read. "Done what?" "Managed emergencies. Taken charge when things went bad." Frank returned to his work without answering immediately. When he finally spoke, his words were careful and measured. "You learn to stay calm when other people are counting on you," he said. "Panicking doesn't help anyone." Jake wanted to ask more questions, but Frank's manner suggested the conversation was over. Still, the young boxer had seen enough to know that his suspicions about the janitor were correct. Frank Thompson was much more than he appeared to be. Word of how Frank had handled the tornado emergency spread quickly through Millfield's small community. Mike Murphy made sure everyone knew that his janitor had potentially saved lives with his quick thinking and calm leadership. The local newspaper even ran a small story about the incident, referring to Frank as a local hero who had helped protect people during the severe weather. Frank hated the attention. Jake noticed that he seemed uncomfortable whenever anyone mentioned the tornado, and he deflected any praise with comments about just doing what needed to be done. But the incident had changed how people at the gym viewed him. He was no longer invisible. Mrs. Patterson brought him homemade cookies the following week. Steve, the powerlifter, made a point of thanking Frank personally and asking if there was anything he could do to return the favor. Even some of the younger gym members who had previously ignored Frank began nodding acknowledgement when they saw him. Jake continued to watch Frank carefully, looking for more clues about his background. He noticed that Frank's reactions to certain sounds were unusual. He would pause when airplanes flew overhead, and sudden loud noises caused him to turn toward the source with an alertness that seemed automatic rather than conscious. One morning, Jake arrived early and found Frank in the parking lot, not cleaning or setting up equipment, but standing perfectly still and scanning the horizon. When Jake approached, Frank seemed to snap back to awareness. "Beautiful sunrise," Frank said, as if that explained why he had been standing motionless in a parking lot. But Jake had noticed the direction Frank had been looking, not toward the sunrise, but toward the road leading into town, as if he were watching for something or someone. These observations might have remained just curiosities if not for what happened on a Thursday morning in early November. Jake was working on the heavy bag when a man in military dress uniform entered the gym. He was middle-aged, with close-cropped hair and the bearing of a career soldier. He looked around the gym as if searching for someone specific. Mike Murphy greeted the visitor and pointed toward the back of the gym where Frank was restocking towels. The soldier walked directly to Frank, and Jake watched their interaction with intense interest. The conversation was brief and conducted in low voices that Jake couldn't overhear from his position. But he could see that both men were serious, and there was something formal about their interaction. The soldier handed Frank what looked like an envelope. They shook hands, and then the visitor left as quickly as he had arrived. Frank stood for a long moment looking at the envelope before slipping it into his back pocket. When he resumed his work, his movements seemed more deliberate than usual, as if his mind was occupied with whatever message he had just received. Jake finished his workout and was heading toward the exit when Frank intercepted him near the front desk. "Jake," Frank said quietly, "could I have a word with you?" They stepped outside into the parking lot, away from other gym members. Frank seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "I know you've been watching me," Frank said, "trying to figure out who I am, where I come from." Jake felt his face flush with embarrassment at being so obvious in his curiosity. "I didn't mean to—" Frank held up a hand to stop his apology. "It's natural to be curious, and you seem like a good kid who knows how to keep his mouth shut." Frank pulled the envelope from his pocket and held it without opening it. "I'm going to be leaving Millfield soon. There's something I need to take care of." "How soon? End of the month? Maybe sooner?" Jake felt an unexpected sense of loss. Despite never having had a real conversation with Frank, he had come to think of the quiet janitor as a fixture at the gym, a steady presence who made the place feel more secure. "Can I ask where you're going?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on something in the distance. "There's a man who served with me a long time ago. He's in trouble, and he doesn't have anyone else to turn to." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that comes from doing your job too well in places where nobody's supposed to know you were there." Jake didn't fully understand what Frank meant, but he could hear the weight of old obligations in the older man's voice. "Will you come back?" Frank smiled, the first genuine smile Jake had ever seen from him. "I don't know. Depends on how things go." Frank started to walk away, then turned back. "Jake, you're a good fighter with a lot of potential. But remember that the strongest man isn't the one who wins every fight. It's the one who knows which fights are worth having." With that, Frank disappeared back into the gym, leaving Jake alone in the parking lot with more questions than ever. Over the next 2 weeks, Frank continued his regular routine, but Jake noticed subtle changes in his behavior. He seemed more watchful, more alert to his surroundings. Phone calls that he took in the back office lasted longer than usual, and Jake occasionally saw him studying papers that he kept locked in his desk. Jake's training intensified as his fight approached, but he found himself distracted by thoughts of Frank's impending departure. The gym wouldn't be the same without the quiet man who had become such an integral part of its daily rhythm. On a Friday morning, 2 weeks before Frank was scheduled to leave, Jake arrived at the gym to find it buzzing with unusual activity. 3 men in suits were talking with Mike Murphy near the front desk, and their serious expressions suggested this wasn't a social visit. Frank was nowhere to be seen. Jake began his workout, but kept an eye on the conversation at the front desk. The men in suits were asking questions, taking notes, and occasionally glancing around the gym as if looking for someone. After about 20 minutes, the men left, and Mike Murphy disappeared into his office. Jake finished his training session and approached the front desk where the regular desk clerk, Sarah, was working. "What was that about?" Jake asked casually. "Jake." Sarah looked around to make sure no one else was listening. "They were asking about Frank. Government types, I think. Wanted to know about his work schedule, who he talked to, that kind of thing." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Did they say what they wanted with him? No, but Mike looked worried. Said Frank called in sick today, first time in 10 years. Jake left the gym with his mind racing. Frank had never seemed like the type of man to call in sick unless something serious was wrong. Combined with the visit from the government agents, Jake was beginning to fear that Frank might be in some kind of trouble. That afternoon, Jake decided to drive by Frank's address. He had seen it on mail that was occasionally delivered to the gym, and Millfield was small enough that he could find the street without much difficulty. Frank lived in a small, well-maintained house on the outskirts of town. His pickup truck was in the driveway, but the house looked empty. The curtains were drawn, and there were no signs of activity. Jake parked across the street and sat in his car, not sure what he was hoping to accomplish. He was about to leave when he saw movement in Frank's backyard. Someone was there, moving around behind the house. Jake got out of his car and walked casually down the street, trying to get a better view of Frank's property. What he saw made him stop in his tracks. Frank was in his backyard, but he wasn't alone. 2 other men were with him, and they were engaged in what looked like serious preparation for something. There were maps spread on a picnic table, equipment laid out on the ground, and weapons visible. Jake recognized one of the men as the soldier who had visited Frank at the gym. The other was younger, wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself with the same military bearing. Jake watched for several minutes, trying to understand what he was seeing. This wasn't a social gathering or a neighborhood barbecue. These men were planning something that required careful preparation and serious equipment. Frank suddenly looked up and spotted Jake across the street. Their eyes met for a moment, and Jake expected anger or surprise. Instead, Frank simply nodded, as if he had been expecting to be discovered. Frank said something to the other men, then walked toward the street where Jake was standing. When he reached the sidewalk, Frank gestured for Jake to follow him to a small park at the end of the block. "You shouldn't be here," Frank said when they were out of earshot of the house. "Those government guys came to the gym looking for you," Jake replied. "I was worried something was wrong." Frank sighed and sat down on a park bench, suddenly looking every one of his 68 years. "Everything's wrong, Jake. That's the problem. What's going on?" Frank was quiet for a long time, staring at the ground as if trying to decide how much to reveal. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old pain. 30 years ago, I was part of a unit that didn't officially exist. We did things that needed to be done, in places where regular military couldn't operate. Most of us who survived have been living quiet lives ever since, trying to forget what we saw and did. What kind of things? The kind that keep people like you safe, but that most folks are better off not knowing about. Frank pulled a photograph from his wallet and handed it to Jake. It showed 8 men in military fatigues, standing in what looked like a jungle setting. They were young, hard-looking, with the 1,000-yard stare that Jake had seen in other combat veterans. "That was my team," Frank said, pointing to himself in the photo. 3 of us are still alive. One of them is in trouble now, being held by people who want to use him to get information about operations from decades ago. Jake studied the photograph, trying to reconcile the young soldier in the picture with the gray-haired janitor he had known for months. "Why you?" Jake asked. "Why not send the regular military?" Frank took the photograph back and returned it to his wallet. "Because officially, we never existed. The government can't send help without acknowledging operations they've spent 30 years denying. and because the people holding my friend know that sooner or later his old team members will come for him. So you're walking into a trap. Probably. But we don't leave our people behind, Jake. That's not who we are. Jake felt a mix of admiration and fear for the older man. Frank was preparing to risk his life for a friend based on loyalties forged decades ago in circumstances Jake could barely imagine. What can I do to help? Frank looked surprised by the offer. Nothing. This isn't your fight. You've been watching over everyone at the gym for years. You kept us safe during the tornado. Maybe it's time someone watched over you. Frank smiled sadly. I appreciate that, Jake. But this is something I have to do with my old team. We know how to work together, how to trust each other. Adding someone new would just create more risk. Jake understood, but he didn't like feeling helpless while Frank prepared to walk into danger. When do you leave? Tomorrow night. We'll drive down to North Carolina, assess the situation, and go in Sunday morning. Frank stood up from the bench, signaling that their conversation was over. Jake, if something happens to me, I want you to know that getting to watch you develop as a fighter has been one of the best parts of these last few months. You've got something special, not just skill, but character. Don't waste it. They shook hands, and Jake felt the strength in Frank's grip, the calluses that spoke of a lifetime of hard work and harder choices. Be careful, Jake said. Always am, Frank replied, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. Jake barely slept that night. He kept thinking about Frank and his two mysterious companions, preparing for what sounded like an extremely dangerous mission. Jake's knowledge of military operations came mostly from movies and books, but he understood enough to know that Frank was essentially planning to conduct a rescue operation against unknown odds with minimal support. Saturday morning at the gym felt surreal. Frank was there, going through his normal routine as if nothing had changed. But Jake noticed the differences. Frank moved with more purpose. His eyes constantly scanned the environment, and he seemed to be saying goodbye to the place without actually saying goodbye. Other gym members noticed something too. Mrs. Patterson commented that Frank seemed different somehow. Tommy Kowalski watched Frank with the sharp eyes of someone who had seen men prepare for fights before. He's getting ready for something, Tommy told Jake during a break in training. I've seen that look before in fighters before big matches. Focused, calm, but coiled like a spring. Jake wanted to tell Tommy what was really happening, but he had given Frank his word to keep quiet. Instead, he just nodded and tried to concentrate on his own training. Throughout the day, Jake found excuses to be near Frank, hoping for another chance to talk. But Frank seemed to be deliberately avoiding prolonged contact with anyone. He completed his work efficiently and professionally, but without his usual small interactions with gym members. As evening approached, Jake realized that Frank would soon be leaving for North Carolina, and he might never see the older man again. The thought bothered him more than he expected. Despite their limited conversations, Frank had become something like a mentor to Jake, a steady presence who represented values of duty, sacrifice, and quiet strength. Jake was preparing to leave the gym when Mike Murphy approached him. Jake, could you help me with something? Mike asked. Frank's truck won't start and he needs a ride home. Could you give him a lift? Jake agreed immediately, suspecting that this might be his last chance to talk with Frank before the older man disappeared into whatever dangerous situation awaited him in North Carolina. The drive to Frank's house was quiet at first. Frank stared out the window at the familiar streets of Millfield, perhaps wondering if he would see them again. Jake searched for something meaningful to say, but everything that came to mind seemed inadequate. Frank, Jake finally said as they pulled into the driveway, I know you can't tell me details about what you're doing, but I want you to know that I understand why you're doing it. Frank turned to look at him, one eyebrow raised questioningly. Loyalty, Jake continued. Standing by your friends when they need you, even when it's dangerous. That's something worth respecting. Frank nodded slowly. Most people today don't understand that kind of obligation. They think loyalty is something you can turn on and off like a light switch. They sat in the car for a moment, neither wanting to end what might be their final conversation. "Jake," Frank said finally, "I want to tell you something about the man we're going to help. His name is David Chen. He was the best soldier I ever served with. Smart, brave, never left anyone behind. After we mustered out, he became a teacher. Spent 20 years teaching kids in inner-city schools, trying to make a difference." Frank's voice grew quieter. 2 months ago, someone figured out who he used to be. They took him because they want information about missions that are still classified. They're torturing a man who spent his life serving others, and they're doing it because of things we did 30 years ago. Jake could hear the pain in Frank's voice, the weight of old guilt and current responsibility. "That's why you have to go," Jake said. It wasn't a question. "That's why I have to go," Frank confirmed. "David would do the same for me. Hell, he has done the same for me." Frank opened the car door, then paused. "Jake, if you don't hear from me in 2 weeks, there's something I want you to do." He pulled a small key from his pocket and handed it to Jake. "This opens a safe deposit box at First National Bank. Box 247. Inside, you'll find some papers and a letter. The letter explains everything. Who I really was, what we did, why it mattered. I want you to give that letter to Mike Murphy. He deserves to know who he was employing all these years." Jake took the key, feeling its weight like a sacred trust. "Frank, you're going to come back. You have to." Frank smiled. "I hope so, son. I really do." Jake watched Frank walk to his front door, noting that the older man's posture was straighter than usual, his movements more alert. This wasn't the tired janitor heading home after a long day. This was a soldier preparing for battle. That night, Jake couldn't concentrate on anything. He tried watching television, reading, even cleaning his apartment, but his mind kept returning to Frank and whatever was happening in that small house across town. Finally, around midnight, he decided to drive by Frank's place one more time. The house was dark, and Frank's pickup truck was gone. Jake realized that the mission had begun. "Your head's not in the game," Tommy observed after Jake missed several combinations that should have been automatic. "What's eating at you?" Jake couldn't explain about Frank's mission, but he tried to give Tommy a partial truth. "Just worried about someone. A friend who's dealing with a difficult situation." "Well, worry doesn't help your friend, and it sure as hell doesn't help your training," Tommy said bluntly. "You've got a fight in 3 weeks. Whatever's bothering you, you need to put it aside and focus." Tommy was right, but Jake found it impossible to concentrate fully on boxing, while Frank was somewhere facing unknown dangers. Every time Jake hit the heavy bag, he found himself thinking about Frank's hands, scarred from experiences Jake could only imagine. Every time he worked on defensive techniques, he wondered if Frank was using similar skills in a life-or-death situation. On Wednesday morning, Jake arrived at the gym to find Mike Murphy talking with the same government agents who had visited the previous week. This time, their expressions were even more serious, and they stayed longer, asking detailed questions about Frank's habits, contacts, and behavior. After they left, Jake approached Mike at the front desk. "Any word from Frank?" Jake asked, trying to sound casual. Mike shook his head, looking worried. "He said he might be gone for a while, but he usually checks in every few days. It's been almost a week now." Jake felt a growing sense of dread. Frank had said the mission would take place on Sunday morning. It was now Wednesday, and there had been no word. Either the operation was taking much longer than expected, or something had gone wrong. That afternoon, Jake made a decision that he knew Frank would disapprove of. He drove to the First National Bank and asked to access Box 247. The bank employee verified his key and led him to the safe deposit box area. Inside the box, Jake found exactly what Frank had described. Several official-looking documents and a sealed envelope marked, "For Mike Murphy, open only if something happens to Frank Thompson." Jake also found something Frank hadn't mentioned: a second envelope, unmarked, but containing what appeared to be contact information for several people. Phone numbers, addresses, and names that meant nothing to Jake, but that might be important if Frank was in trouble. Jake studied the contact list, debating whether he should try calling any of the numbers. Frank had told him to wait 2 weeks, but that might be too long if Frank and his team were in immediate danger. One name on the list caught Jake's attention: emergency contact, Colonel Patricia Williams, retired Pentagon liaison. There was a phone number with a Virginia area code. Jake stared at the number for a long time, weighing his options. Frank had trusted him with the key to the safe deposit box, which suggested that Frank valued Jake's judgment. But Frank had also specifically said to wait 2 weeks before taking any action. In the end, Jake's concern for Frank outweighed his reluctance to go against the older man's instructions. He called the number from his cell phone. The call was answered on the second ring by a crisp, professional voice. "Williams." "Colonel Williams? My name is Jake Martinez. I'm calling about Frank Thompson." There was a pause. "How do you know that name?" "Frank and we work at the same place. He's been missing for several days, and I'm worried something might have happened to him." "Mr. Martinez, I'm going to need you to answer some questions before we continue this conversation. First, where did you get this number?" Jake explained about the safe deposit box and the key Frank had given him. He described the government agents who had been asking questions about Frank at the gym. Colonel Williams listened without interrupting, and Jake could hear her taking notes. When he finished his explanation, she was quiet for several seconds. "Mr. Martinez," she said finally, "Frank Thompson and 2 other men departed for a classified operation 6 days ago. We lost contact with their team 72 hours ago." Jake felt his stomach drop. "What does that mean?" "It means they're either dead, captured, or operating under radio silence. Given the nature of their mission, all 3 possibilities are equally likely." "Is anyone going to help them?" "Officially. The operation Frank volunteered for is completely off the books. The government cannot acknowledge it or provide support without creating an international incident." Jake felt anger rising in his chest. "So you just sent them in there alone, and now you're abandoning them?" "Mr. Martinez, Frank and his team knew the risks when they volunteered. They also knew that if something went wrong, they would be on their own. That's the nature of this type of operation." "That's not right." "Right and wrong don't always align with what's possible in this business," Colonel Williams said softly. Frank knew that better than most. Jake ended the call feeling frustrated and helpless. Frank was somewhere in danger, possibly dead or captured, and the government that had sent him was doing nothing to help. But Jake wasn't the government. He was just a young boxer from a small Pennsylvania town who happened to care about a quiet janitor who had shown him what real strength looked like. Jake made another decision that he knew Frank would disapprove of even more than the first one. Jake spent the rest of Wednesday and most of Thursday researching everything he could find about military rescue operations, hostage situations, and North Carolina geography. He used the gym's computer after hours, staying late into the night to search for information that might help him understand what Frank was facing. What he learned was both educational and terrifying. Military rescue operations were incredibly complex, requiring detailed intelligence, specialized equipment, and extensive training. The fact that Frank and his 2 companions had attempted such a mission with minimal resources spoke to either their desperation or their extraordinary capabilities. Jake also researched the background of the conflict Frank had described. While specific details about classified operations were obviously not available, he found enough information about covert activities in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam era to understand the kind of work Frank's unit had performed. These men had been the elite of the elite, chosen for missions that required not just military skill, but intelligence, adaptability, and the ability to operate independently in hostile territory. They had been the ones called upon when conventional forces couldn't be used, when the government needed results but couldn't afford to leave fingerprints. The more Jake learned, the more he realized how much Frank had understated his own capabilities and experience. The quiet janitor who had cleaned floors and restocked towels for 10 years had once been one of the most dangerous men in the world. On Friday morning, Jake called in sick to skip his training session and drove to Washington, D.C. He didn't have a plan beyond finding Colonel Williams and demanding more information about Frank's situation. It was probably a foolish mission, but Jake couldn't stand sitting in Millfield doing nothing while Frank might be suffering or dying. The Pentagon was an imposing building that made Jake feel very small and very out of place. Security was tight, and Jake quickly realized that he couldn't just walk in and ask to speak with Colonel Williams. He needed a better approach. Jake spent the afternoon in a coffee shop near the Pentagon, watching people come and go, trying to figure out how to make contact with Colonel Williams outside of official channels. He was about to give up when he noticed a woman in civilian clothes who carried herself with military bearing and was about the right age to be a retired colonel. Taking a chance, Jake approached her as she waited for her order. "Excuse me," he said nervously. "Are you by any chance Colonel Patricia Williams?" The woman turned to study him with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Who's asking?" "Jake Martinez. I called you earlier this week about Frank Thompson." Colonel Williams's expression became guarded. "Mr. Martinez, I told you everything I could over the phone. There's nothing more I can share." "Colonel, I think Frank is going to die if someone doesn't help him. Maybe he's already dead. And you're telling me the government is just going to pretend none of this ever happened?" Williams looked around the coffee shop, checking to see if anyone was listening to their conversation. "Mr. Martinez, let's take a walk." They left the coffee shop and walked through a nearby park. Colonel Williams remained silent until they were well away from other people. "Jake, may I call you Jake? You need to understand something about the kind of work Frank did. Men like him volunteered for missions that existed in the gray areas between right and wrong, legal and illegal. They did things that needed to be done, but that the government could never officially acknowledge." "I understand that," Jake replied, "but that doesn't mean they should be abandoned when they need help. The government isn't abandoning them. The government was never officially involved in the first place." Williams stopped walking and faced Jake directly. "Frank Thompson and his team are attempting to rescue a man who was kidnapped by a criminal organization with connections to foreign intelligence services. If the U.S. military were to intervene directly, it could be interpreted as an act of war. Do you understand the implications of that?" Jake felt the weight of international politics pressing down on the situation. Frank wasn't just dealing with kidnappers. He was walking into a minefield of diplomatic complications that could affect relationships between nations. "So Frank and his friends are expendable," Jake said bitterly. "Frank and his friends are volunteers who understand the risks and accept them. That doesn't make them expendable. It makes them heroes." Colonel Williams resumed walking, her pace slower now, more thoughtful. "Jake, I can see that you care about Frank. That speaks well of you and of him. But there are things happening here that you don't understand. Forces at work that are bigger than one man's safety." "Then explain it to me," Jake demanded. "Help me understand why a good man has to die for politics." Williams was quiet for a long time, clearly debating how much she could or should reveal. "The man Frank is trying to rescue David Chen, was captured because he had information about weapons caches and safe houses that were established during covert operations in the 1970s and 1980s. Some of those caches still exist, and in the wrong hands, they could be used to carry out terrorist attacks on American soil. Jake felt a chill as the implications became clear. So the people who took David want to use old American weapons against Americans? Exactly. And they're willing to torture a retired teacher to get the information they need. Why doesn't the government just destroy the weapons caches? Because officially, they don't exist. Acknowledging them would require admitting to operations that violated international law and congressional oversight. The political fallout would be catastrophic. Jake began to understand the impossible situation Frank had walked into. The government couldn't act officially without creating a scandal that could bring down administrations and destroy international relationships. But they also couldn't allow the weapons caches to fall into terrorist hands. So Frank and his team are the only option, Jake said. Frank and his team are the best option. They know where the caches are, they understand the security measures that protect them, and they can operate without creating an international incident. If they're still alive? If they're still alive, Williams agreed grimly. They had reached the edge of the park, and Williams turned to face Jake one more time. Jake, I'm going to tell you something that I probably shouldn't. We haven't heard from Frank's team in 4 days, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're dead or captured. These men are experts at operating without communications when necessary. They might be maintaining radio silence to avoid detection. How long before you know for sure? Frank's mission parameters included a 2-week window for completion. If we don't hear from them by next Wednesday, we'll know something has gone wrong. Jake realized that Colonel Williams had just given him the same time frame Frank had specified for opening the safe deposit box. The 2-week deadline wasn't arbitrary. It was based on realistic expectations for how long the mission might take. Colonel, if they don't make contact by Wednesday, what then? Williams looked tired, older than her years. Then we'll know that 3 good men died trying to prevent a terrorist attack that most Americans will never know was possible. Jake thanked Colonel Williams for her honesty and began the long drive back to Millfield. He had learned more than he expected, but he still felt helpless to influence the outcome of Frank's mission. All he could do was wait and hope that the quiet janitor who had become his unlikely mentor would somehow find a way to survive whatever he was facing in the shadows of a world most people never knew existed. The weekend passed slowly. Jake tried to maintain his normal routine, but everything felt different at the gym without Frank's steady presence. The temporary replacement was doing his best, but the place lacked the sense of security and order that Frank had provided. Jake found himself staring at the corner where Frank used to clean equipment, remembering conversations that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt like precious glimpses into the character of an extraordinary man. On Monday morning, Jake was hitting the heavy bag when Mike Murphy approached him with an expression of concern. Jake, there are some people here who want to talk to you about Frank. Jake's heart rate spiked as he followed Mike to the front office. Waiting for him were 2 people he didn't recognize, a man in his 50s wearing a rumpled suit, and a woman about the same age in casual clothes. Both had the bearing of law enforcement or intelligence personnel. Mr. Martinez, the man said, extending his hand. I'm Agent Harrison with the FBI. This is Agent Chen. We'd like to ask you some questions about Frank Thompson. Jake noticed the woman's last name and wondered if she might be related to David Chen, the man Frank had gone to rescue. Her Asian features and intense expression suggested the possibility. What kind of questions? Jake asked cautiously. We understand that Frank spoke with you before he left town, Agent Harrison said. We're hoping you might have information that could help us locate him. Jake thought about his promise to Frank and his conversation with Colonel Williams. He decided to be careful about what he revealed. Frank said he was going away for a while to help a friend who was in trouble. He didn't give me details about where he was going or what he planned to do. Agent Chen leaned forward. Mr. Martinez, the friend Frank went to help is my brother. We believe Frank and his team may be in serious danger, and we're trying to find them before it's too late. Jake studied Agent Chen's face, seeing genuine worry and fear. If she was David Chen's sister, her concern was personal as well as professional. How did you know to come to me? Jake asked. Frank's neighbors reported seeing him talking with a young man in a car last week. The license plate led us to you. Agent Harrison consulted his notes. We also know that Frank visited his safe deposit box recently and withdrew several items. We're hoping he might have shared information about his plans with you. Jake realized he was in a delicate position. He had information that might help locate Frank, but he also had explicit instructions from Frank not to reveal anything for 2 weeks. Agents, I want to help, but Frank specifically asked me not to discuss his business with anyone. He said it could be dangerous. Mr. Martinez, Agent Chen said urgently, my brother has been missing for 2 months. Frank and his team have been out of contact for 5 days. Whatever Frank asked you to keep secret, the situation has changed. Jake made a decision based on the desperation he could see in Agent Chen's eyes. Frank gave me a key to his safe deposit box. He said if I didn't hear from him in 2 weeks, I should open it and give certain information to Mike Murphy. What kind of information? Documents that explain who Frank really was and what he did during his military service. There was also a list of contact numbers for people who might be able to help in an emergency. Agent Harrison and Agent Chen exchanged glances. Mr. Martinez, would you be willing to access that safe deposit box now? With our supervision, of course. Jake considered the request. Frank had said 2 weeks, but Frank had also said the mission would be completed by now. The fact that government agents were actively looking for Frank suggested that something had gone wrong. If it might help find Frank and your brother, then yes. An hour later, Jake found himself back at First National Bank, this time accompanied by 2 FBI agents. The bank manager was nervous about the unusual circumstances, but Agent Harrison's credentials and a hastily obtained court order convinced him to cooperate. Jake opened the safe deposit box and removed the contents, handing everything to Agent Chen except for the sealed letter marked for Mike Murphy. Agent Chen examined the contact list that Jake had seen before, her expression becoming more intense as she read. This is important, she told Agent Harrison. Some of these names are people who can authorize resources that we can't access through normal channels. What kind of resources? Jake asked. The kind that might be needed to rescue Frank and his team, Agent Harrison replied. Agent Chen was already on her phone, calling one of the numbers from Frank's list. Jake could hear only one side of the conversation, but it was clear that she was talking to someone with significant authority. Yes, sir. We have credible information that the Thompson team is in immediate danger. No, sir. We can't wait for official authorization. I understand the political implications, but we're talking about American citizens being tortured by foreign operatives. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Agent Chen becoming more insistent as it progressed. Finally, she ended the call and turned to Agent Harrison. They're going to help, but it has to be completely off the books. No official involvement, no paper trail, no acknowledgement if something goes wrong. What does that mean for Frank? Jake asked. It means that people who care more about him than about politics are going to try to bring him home, Agent Chen replied. Jake felt a surge of hope for the first time in days. When? Tonight. There's a military unit that specializes in exactly this type of situation. They're already being briefed on what we know about Frank's mission. Agent Harrison gathered up the documents from Frank's safe deposit box. Mr. Martinez, you've been very helpful. But from this point forward, you need to forget everything you've heard here today. Will you let me know if Frank is okay?" Agent Chen smiled for the first time since Jake had met her. "If everything goes according to plan, Frank will be able to tell you himself." Jake returned to the gym that afternoon with mixed feelings. He was hopeful that help was finally on the way for Frank, but he was also worried about what the older man might be enduring while waiting for rescue. That evening, Jake couldn't concentrate on anything. He kept thinking about Frank and the mysterious military unit that was supposedly going to help him. Jake had no way of knowing if the rescue operation was actually taking place or if it would be successful. He was preparing for bed when his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. "Hello?" "Jake, it's Frank." Jake nearly dropped the phone in relief. "Frank, are you okay? Where are you?" "I'm fine, son. A little banged up, but fine. David's okay too. We're at a military hospital in North Carolina, getting checked out." "What happened?" "We were worried you were dead." Frank's voice sounded tired but steady. "It was more complicated than we expected. The people holding David had more security than we anticipated, and they were expecting us. We had to go to ground for several days before we could make our move." "But you got him out?" "We got him out, and we destroyed the weapons caches he knew about, so the bad guys won't be able to use them for anything." Jake felt overwhelming relief. "When are you coming home?" There was a pause. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about, Jake. I'm not sure I'm coming back to Millfield." Jake's heart sank. "Why not?" "This mission reminded me of something I'd forgotten. I'm not ready to retire completely. There are still people out there who need help, and I might be able to provide it." "What does that mean?" "It means I might be taking a job with people who do this kind of work on a regular basis, helping former special operations personnel who get into trouble because of their past service." Jake understood what Frank was saying, but he didn't like it. "Will I see you again?" "Probably not for a while. But Jake, I want you to know that getting to know you has been one of the best parts of the last few years. You're going to be a great fighter, and more importantly, you're going to be a good man." Jake felt tears in his eyes. "Frank, you changed my life. I hope you know that." "You changed mine too, son. Take care of yourself." The line went dead, and Jake sat in his apartment holding the phone, trying to process the end of his relationship with the most remarkable person he had ever known. Jake returned to the gym the next morning with mixed emotions. Frank was safe, which was the most important thing, but he was also gone, and Jake wasn't sure when or if he would see the older man again. Mike Murphy was waiting for Jake when he arrived, holding the sealed envelope that Frank had left for him. "Jake, Agent Chen stopped by this morning and told me that Frank is safe. She also gave me this." Mike held up the envelope. "She said you knew what it was about." Jake nodded. "Frank wanted you to have that if something happened to him. I guess since he's not coming back, he figured you should know the truth." Mike studied the envelope for a long moment, then carefully opened it. Jake watched as the gym owner read Frank's letter, his expression changing from curiosity to amazement to something approaching awe. When Mike finished reading, he looked up at Jake with wide eyes. "Did you know?" Mike asked. "I suspected there was more to Frank than he let on. I didn't know the specifics until this week." Mike handed Jake the letter. "Read it. Frank says in here that you were the only person who really saw who he was." Jake took the letter and read Frank's words, written in the same careful handwriting he had seen on work orders and maintenance logs for months. "Mike," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means I didn't come back from something I had to do. I want you to know who you've been employing for the last 10 years and why I chose to work for you. My name is Franklin James Thompson. I served in the U.S. Army from 1966 to 1995, retiring with the rank of Sergeant Major. Most of my service was with special operations units that conducted classified missions in Southeast Asia, Central America, and the Middle East. I received the Congressional Medal of Honor for actions in Cambodia in 1971, the Distinguished Service Cross for operations in El Salvador in 1983, and numerous other decorations that I never displayed because the missions they recognized were classified. After I retired from the Army, I worked briefly as a military contractor, but I found that I missed the simple satisfaction of honest work and peaceful surroundings. When I came to Millfield and found your gym, I realized it was exactly what I needed. A place where I could be useful without being in charge, where I could watch young people challenge themselves and grow stronger. I never told anyone about my background because I didn't want to be treated differently. I wanted to be judged by how well I did my job, not by what I had done in the past. You gave me that opportunity, and I will always be grateful. The young man who brings you this letter, Jake Martinez, is special. He has the instincts of a natural fighter, but more importantly, he has the character of a natural leader. He saw through my disguise when no one else did, not because he was looking for glory or excitement, but because he cared about the people around him. Jake reminds me of the best men I served with, brave, loyal, and willing to sacrifice for others. Whatever he asks of you, give it to him. Whatever he needs to succeed, provide it. He has the potential to be extraordinary, and I regret that I won't be there to see him achieve it. Thank you for giving an old soldier a place to find peace. Take care of Jake, and take care of yourself. Respectfully, Franklin James Thompson, Sergeant Major, U.S. Army, retired. Jake finished reading and handed the letter back to Mike, who was wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. 10 years, Mike said quietly. 10 years I had a war hero cleaning my floors, and I never knew it. He didn't want you to know, Jake replied. That's what made him special. Mike folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. Jake, Frank was right about you. You did see something the rest of us missed. I just paid attention. No, it was more than that. You looked at Frank and saw a person, not just an employee. That's rare. Jake thought about all the mornings he had watched Frank work, all the small interactions that had seemed insignificant at the time, but that had revealed glimpses of the man's true character. Mike, what are you going to do with Frank's letter? Frame it, Mike said immediately. Put it up behind the front desk where everyone can see it. Frank spent 10 years taking care of this place and the people in it. The least we can do is make sure people remember him. Over the following days, word spread through the gym about Frank's true identity. The revelation changed how people thought about the quiet janitor who had been part of their daily routine for so long. Mrs. Patterson cried when she learned that the man who had helped her with equipment and always made sure she had fresh towels was a decorated war hero. Steve, the powerlifter, said it explained why Frank had always seemed so calm and confident during emergencies. Tommy Kowalski wasn't surprised. I knew there was more to him, he told Jake. You don't get that kind of presence from cleaning floors. You get it from leading men in dangerous situations. Jake's training continued, but with new motivation. Every time he hit the heavy bag, he thought about Frank's words about character being more important than strength. Every time he worked on technique, he remembered Frank's lesson about knowing which fights were worth having. His upcoming fight took on new meaning as well. It wasn't just about winning or losing anymore. It was about honoring the memory of a man who had taught him what real courage looked like. 3 weeks after Frank's departure, Jake stepped into the ring for his scheduled fight. It was a regional amateur championship match against an opponent who was bigger, stronger, and more experienced. Jake should have been nervous, but instead, he felt calm and focused. As he warmed up in the dressing room, Jake thought about everything Frank had taught him, not through formal instruction, but through example. Quiet strength. Doing your job without complaining. Being ready to help when others needed it. Standing by your friends no matter what the cost. The fight was held at the Civic Center in Allentown, about an hour from Millfield. Jake was surprised to see how many people from his hometown had made the trip to watch him compete. Mike Murphy was there, of course, along with Tommy Kowalski and several other trainers from the gym. Mrs. Patterson had even bought a ticket, sitting in the front row with a homemade sign that read, "Go Jake." But the person Jake most wanted to see wasn't there, and wouldn't be. The opening bell rang, and Jake began implementing the fighting strategy he and Tommy had developed. His opponent was aggressive, trying to use his size advantage to intimidate Jake and force a quick finish. But Jake remained calm, moving efficiently, waiting for his opportunities. In the third round, Jake's opponent caught him with a hard right hand that staggered him backward. For a moment, Jake felt dizzy and off balance, vulnerable to a follow-up attack that could end the fight. That's when he heard Frank's voice in his memory. "You learn to stay calm when other people are counting on you. Panicking doesn't help anyone." Jake steadied himself, covered up to avoid further damage, and waited for the moment to counterattack. When his opponent overcommitted to a big punch, Jake slipped inside and landed a perfect uppercut that dropped the bigger man to the canvas. The referee counted to 10, and Jake Martinez was declared the winner by knockout. As Jake celebrated with his corner team, he looked up toward the ceiling of the Civic Center and whispered, "Thank you, Frank." Later, at the celebration dinner that Mike Murphy organized, Jake was approached by a man he didn't recognize. The stranger was well-dressed, middle-aged, and carried himself with an air of authority. "Mr. Martinez, my name is David Chen. I wanted to thank you personally." Jake realized he was meeting the man Frank had risked his life to rescue. David Chen looked healthier than Jake had expected, considering his ordeal, but there was something in his eyes that spoke of experiences he would never forget. "Mr. Chen, I'm glad you're safe. Frank was very worried about you." "Frank saved my life, and apparently you played a role in saving his. Agent Chen, my sister, told me how you helped locate the information that made his rescue possible." David Chen handed Jake a small package. "This is from Frank. He asked me to give it to you the next time I was in Pennsylvania." Jake opened the package to find a simple wooden box containing a military challenge coin. On one side was the insignia of Frank's old unit. On the other was an inscription, "To Jake Martinez, a young man who understands what matters. FJT. Frank wanted you to know that he's proud of you," David said. "He also wanted me to tell you that if you ever need anything at all, you should call this number." He handed Jake a business card with only a phone number printed on it. Jake studied the coin, feeling the weight of Frank's respect and friendship. "Mr. Chen, is Frank happy? Where he is now, I mean." David smiled. "Frank is doing what he was born to do, helping people who can't help themselves. He's working with an organization that assists former special operations personnel who get into trouble because of their past service. It's dangerous work, but it's important work. Will I see him again? I think you will. Frank doesn't forget the people who matter to him." Over the months that followed, Jake continued his boxing career with new confidence and purpose. He won his next 3 fights, each time thinking of Frank's lessons about character, loyalty, and quiet strength. The gym changed too. Mike Murphy had Frank's letter framed and mounted behind the front desk, along with a small plaque that read, "In honor of Franklin James Thompson, who taught us that true heroes don't seek recognition, they earn respect." Jake became something of a leader among the younger athletes at the gym, passing on the wisdom Frank had shared with him. He taught them about the importance of hard work, about treating others with dignity, about being ready to help when help was needed. One morning, about 6 months after Frank's departure, Jake arrived at the gym to find something unusual. The equipment had been cleaned and organized with a precision that reminded him of Frank's work. The towels were folded exactly the way Frank had folded them. Even the air seemed fresher, as if someone had spent hours making sure everything was perfect. Mike Murphy was standing behind the front desk with a smile on his face. "Frank came by last night," Mike said simply. "Left this for you." He handed Jake an envelope with his name written in Frank's familiar handwriting. Inside was a brief note. "Jake, heard about your winning streak. Knew you had it in you. Still fighting the good fight, just in different places now. Remember what I taught you about knowing which battles matter. Take care of yourself and the gym. F." Jake looked around the gymnasium, imagining Frank moving through his old routine one more time, making sure everything was ready for another day of training and growth. "Did you see him?" Jake asked. Mike shook his head. "Got here this morning and found everything like this." Frank always was good at coming and going without being noticed. Jake smiled, understanding that this was probably how it would always be with Frank Thompson. The older man would appear when he was needed, do what needed to be done, and disappear back into the shadows where he preferred to work. But his influence would remain, carried forward by the people whose lives he had touched, taught through example rather than instruction, passed down from one generation to the next. 5 years after Frank Thompson left Mill Field, Jake Martinez had become one of the most respected fighters in his weight class. He had turned professional 2 years earlier and was now ranked among the top 10 contenders for a regional championship. But more importantly to Jake, he had become the kind of man Frank would be proud of. Jake still trained at Murphy's Fitness, though he could now afford to work out at more prestigious facilities. He stayed because the gym had become more than just a place to train. It was home, and it was where Frank's legacy lived on. The gym had evolved over the years. Mike Murphy had expanded the boxing program and hired additional trainers, but he had also instituted new policies that reflected the values Frank had embodied. There was a scholarship program for young athletes who couldn't afford training fees. There was a mentorship program where experienced fighters worked with newcomers. Most importantly, there was an unwritten rule that everyone treated everyone else with respect, regardless of their background or skill level. Jake had become the unofficial leader of this culture change. As one of the gym's most successful products, his behavior set the tone for how others acted. He made it a point to welcome new members, to offer encouragement to struggling athletes, and to step in when conflicts arose, just as Frank had done years earlier. On a cold February morning, Jake was working with a new boxer named Carlos, a teenager from a troubled background who reminded Jake of himself at that age. Carlos had talent, but lacked discipline, and he had a tendency to start arguments with other gym members. "Keep your hands up," Jake instructed as they worked on defense drills. "Your opponent isn't going to wait for you to remember to protect yourself." Carlos dropped his guard again, his attention wandering to a conversation happening across the gym. Jake stopped the drill and faced the younger fighter. "Carlos, what did I tell you about focus?" "I was listening," Carlos protested. "No, you were hearing. There's a difference. When you're in here training, everything else disappears. The only thing that matters is getting better." Carlos rolled his eyes. "Easy for you to say. You're already successful." Jake set down his gloves and studied the teenager's face. He saw frustration, anger, and underneath it all, fear. Fear of failing, fear of not being good enough, fear of being judged. "Carlos, let me tell you about a man who taught me more about success than any boxing coach ever did." Jake told Carlos about Frank Thompson, about the quiet janitor who had turned out to be a war hero, about the lessons in character and strength that had nothing to do with winning fights and everything to do with being a good person. "The point isn't that Frank was a soldier," Jake concluded. "The point is that he understood what really mattered. He knew that how you treat people, how you handle responsibility, how you respond when others need help, that's what defines you as a person. Carlos listened without interrupting, and Jake could see that the story was having an impact. When Jake finished talking, the teenager was quiet for a long moment. Is he still alive? This Frank guy? This Frank? I think so. I hope so. But I don't know where he is or what he's doing. Do you miss him? Jake considered the question. Every day. But I also carry him with me everywhere I go. The things he taught me, the example he set, that's not something that disappears just because the person is gone. Carlos nodded slowly. Can you tell me more about him sometime? I'd be happy to. Their conversation was interrupted by Mike Murphy, who approached with an expression of excitement that Jake rarely saw on the gym owner's face. Jake, there's someone here to see you. Jake followed Mike to the front desk, expecting to meet a potential sponsor or maybe a reporter wanting to do a story about his upcoming fight. Instead, he found himself face to face with Agent Chen, the FBI agent who had helped coordinate Frank's rescue years earlier. Ms. Chen, Jake said, surprised. What brings you to Millfield? She smiled, looking more relaxed than she had during their previous meeting. I have a message for you from an old friend. Jake's heart rate increased. Frank? He wanted me to tell you that he's proud of how you've developed as a fighter and as a person. He's been following your career from a distance. Is he okay? Where is he? He's fine. He's still working with the organization I mentioned before, helping veterans who get into trouble because of their past service. He can't make contact directly because of security concerns, but he wanted you to know that he thinks about you often. Agent Chen handed Jake a small package. He also wanted you to have this. Inside the package was another challenge coin, different from the one David Chen had given him years earlier. This one bore the insignia of Frank's current organization, and on the reverse side was a simple message. Still fighting the good fight. F. There's something else, Agent Chen said. Frank wanted me to ask if you would be interested in helping his organization occasionally. What kind of help? Sometimes they need people who can blend in, who can go places and do things that experienced operatives can't. Someone like you, young, athletic, clean background, might be useful in certain situations. Jake thought about the offer. Part of him was intrigued by the idea of working with Frank again, even indirectly. But another part of him wondered if he was ready for that kind of responsibility. I don't have any special training, Jake said. Frank says you have something more important than training, good judgment and a strong moral compass. Those are things that can't be taught. Jake looked around the gym, at the young fighters working hard to improve themselves, at the community Frank had helped him build through his example. Can I think about it? Of course. Frank said to tell you that there's no pressure and no timeline. If you're ever interested, just call the number David gave you years ago. After Agent Chen left, Jake sat in the gym's office, holding Frank's new challenge coin and thinking about the unexpected turn his life had taken. 5 years ago, he had been just another young boxer with big dreams and little direction. Now he was being invited to join an organization that operated in the shadows, helping people who had served their country and been forgotten by the system they had protected. Jake thought about Frank's lessons, about doing what was right even when it was difficult, about standing by your friends even when it was dangerous. He thought about the quiet satisfaction that came from helping others, from being useful without seeking recognition. Most importantly, he thought about the kind of man Frank Thompson was, and the kind of man Jake wanted to become. That evening, Jake drove to the small park where he and Frank had walked years earlier. He sat on the same bench where Frank had told him about David Chen and the dangerous mission that had taken him away from Millfield. As the sun set behind the trees, Jake made his decision. He would continue his boxing career for now, continue building the community at Murphy's Fitness, continue trying to be the kind of person Frank had taught him to be. But someday, when the time was right, he would make that phone call. Because Frank Thompson had taught him that some obligations transcended personal ambition, that some friendships lasted beyond time and distance, and that the most important battles were often fought in silence by people the world would never know. Jake stood up from the bench and walked back to his car, Frank's challenge coin warm in his pocket, carrying the quiet strength of a man who had shown him what it meant to be a hero without ever claiming the title. In the distance, a lone figure watched from the shadows between the trees. The figure was older now, grayer, but still moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to be invisible when necessary. Frank Thompson watched Jake drive away, proud of the man the young boxer had become, confident that the lessons he had tried to teach through example had taken root and would grow stronger with time. Frank had returned to Millfield briefly, as he did every few months, to check on the people and places that mattered to him. He couldn't stay long. His work required constant movement, constant vigilance. But he needed to know that the life he had built in this small Pennsylvania town was continuing to flourish in his absence. Tomorrow, Frank would disappear again into the world of shadows and secrets where men like him operated. But tonight, he was content knowing that Jake Martinez understood what really mattered, and that the legacy of service and sacrifice would continue through a new generation. As Frank walked away into the darkness, he carried with him the satisfaction that came from a job well done. Not the dramatic, public kind of heroism that made headlines, but the quiet, persistent kind that changed lives one person at a time. Some heroes wore uniforms and received medals. Others mopped floors and stocked towels, teaching lessons through actions rather than words, building character through example rather than instruction. Frank Thompson had been both kinds of hero, and he had learned that the second kind was often more important than the first. The story of the silent hero would continue, passed down through the people whose lives he had touched, carried forward by those who understood that true strength came not from what you could do to others, but from what you were willing to do for them. In Murphy's Fitness Center, under the fluorescent lights where Frank had once worked in quiet anonymity, new stories were beginning. Young fighters were learning about character and determination. Struggling athletes were finding mentorship and support. And in the corner where Frank's letter hung framed on the wall, visitors could read the words of a man who had understood what it meant to serve. True heroes don't seek recognition. They earn respect. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a lifetime spent in service to others, the wisdom of a man who had found peace in purpose, and the promise that heroism could be found not in the grand gestures that made history, but in the daily choices that made a difference. Frank Thompson's story was over, but his legacy lived on in every young fighter who learned to stand up for what was right, in every act of quiet courage performed without expectation of reward, and in the understanding that the greatest battles were often won not with fists or weapons, but with character and compassion. The silent hero had taught his final lesson, that true strength was measured not by what you could take, but by what you were willing to give. And in that small gym in Millfield, Pennsylvania, the lesson continued to be learned, one day at a time, one person at a time, one act of quiet heroism at a time. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.